Welcome to another wonderful episode of the Defensive Security Podcast. This is episode 317. And joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kellett.
Good evening, afternoon, or morning, as the case may be. Mr. Bell, how are you?
I'm awesome. How are you?
I'm good. And also, I just had a little notification from our little podcast studio app that the actual recording will be of higher quality. So I'm hoping that also includes the content. Does it automatically make your content better?
You know, I gotta get with the Riverside product development people and see what they can do to make our podcast better. But I think they're just talking about the recording quality, not the content.
I live in hope.
I'm with you. I mean, with all this AI technology, it seems like they should be able, like there should be a button, make this not suck. Click.
With as many shows as we've put out, it feels like we could just throw all our episodes at the AI, throw the new stories at the AI, say, go do what we do, and poof, episode. But that wouldn't have the authentic, handcrafted, free range, cruelty free, organic episodes that we put out.
That's true.
Nobody, maybe some people want that commoditized, industrial, AI produced podcast, but not our listeners.
Low carbon footprint. Yep.
Us or the AI versions, because it depends on who you ask. Yeah.
Anyway, before to get us back on track, the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are not ours, not those of our employers. Also, thank you so much to our Patreon sponsors. Just a quick reminder that our Patreon sponsors get the show a week ahead of everybody else. So thank you again. If you want to subscribe, I'll drop a link to our Patreon page in the show notes. It's defensivesecurity.org. Look for episode 317, and sign up. Throw money at us. We're hoping to buy an island someday.
It's true. But also, in all honesty, thank you to our Patreon donors. You guys are awesome. Like, just random people just supporting our show, which is super cool.
Yes. Thank you very much. And again, we will be, we will be working more on some options for live stream, a live stream event, which, by the way, speaking of, we will be appearing live at Mission Security 2025 in about 2.5 weeks.
We should probably, do some planning.
Yeah. That's probably a good idea.
August 20th.
August 20th. It's anyway, I'll drop a link to sign up if you're going to be in the Atlanta area. Unfortunately, it's not going to be live streamed, but it will be in front of a live audience. So no tomatoes, please.
Are we going to have like an applause sign and like a laugh sign?
I assume. Like, how else are people going to know when to laugh?
Probably true. But it'll be cool. Anyway, it'll be cool. Just to set the expectation, it's a security conference with a bunch of different vendors, lots of different tracks. It's put on by a Southeastern regional security reseller called Mission Critical that I have known for a long time and go way back with. So they were kind enough to offer us the lunchtime speaking slot. So perhaps for the last time ever, but we're going to try to do our best.
Yeah. Could be great. Could be awesome. Only time will tell. So anyway, getting into the actual show now. The first story we have today comes from Bleeping Computer. And the title here is Spikes in Malicious Activity Precede New Security Flaws in 80% of Cases. So this seemed on its face like really, quite informative. And I think to a large extent it is. The net point here is that this company Gray Noise analyzed information coming out of their honeypots, or at least what I infer are their honeypots, and have identified that in a subset of scanning activity, They found that activity correlates to a subsequent disclosure of a previously unknown vulnerability. And that sounds a little bit kind of convoluted, but the inference here is that bad actors either they have a heads up that there is something coming, and they're trying to do things like gather an inventory, or it's actually that scanning activity that is resulting in the identification of some new vulnerability. So this is it's kind of a novel concept. I am a little concerned about the kind of the practical applicability of this, maybe outside the potential for subscribing to a service. I'm going to guess that this whole thing is probably leading to a service offering that you can subscribe to. And here we are shilling it. But, anyway, what are your thoughts? You got any,
yeah, it was interesting. I had a couple thoughts from my notes. The way I read this was, so somebody, usually some bad actor, has got some potential vulnerability they're working on, and they may be out there. The way I read it, that they're out there looking for possible targets. They're looking for how best to utilize this, how best to understand this, and it's very interesting to me that they're doing pre-exploit recon, right? And so the way they're correlating this is they're seeing this activity. Let's say it's we use it against a sonic wall, just as an example. So they see all this activity suddenly spike up against sonic walls, testing against previous vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, and then within 3 weeks, there's a CVE that drops 50% of the time for that device. Within 6 weeks, it's 80% of the time. So keep in mind, there's a couple of moving parts here. There's the vulnerability has to be identified, has to be cataloged, the CVE has to be released, which has been backed up for a while. So they could have a 0 day that they're testing out, that they're playing with, and that they're kind of doing some recon before they then target their 0 day. Because in general, if you've got a 0 day, you want maximum applicability before you burn it, right? You use it, you burn it. It's the typical thought process. So it's an interesting concept. I was like, oh, that is cool. And you could potentially infer that something's going on, and you could potentially, maybe depending on what it is, tighten up your defenses or be ready. But then I thought the next step, which is, let's say you start to build some sort of reaction or program around these early pre-attack indicators, as I would consider them. Well, as soon as that becomes commonplace, or even somewhat commonplace, the bad actors could easily start replicating this behavior against other non-valid targets just to muddy the waters, right? So let's say they've got something, again, I'll pick on Sonic Wall. They've got something Sonic Wall, but then they do it against Palo Alto and Fortinet and Checkpoint, and just to screw with the researchers and the indicators of the pre-attack indicators. Once it's known that people are using this, it quickly becomes less useful, because now the bad actors can easily duplicate this behavior against non-valid attacks and confuse and deflect and hide their real intent. So, like anything, it's an arms race, and it's interesting, but I don't know. As an enterprise blue team guy, I often tend to ignore attacks that are bouncing off my perimeter as noise. I tend to not spend a lot of time worrying about them or caring about them, because if my tools are doing what they should be doing, stuff that's getting blocked, stuff that's getting dropped, I don't want to spend a lot of time reacting to it. I want to respond to the stuff that's getting through. But maybe there's something here. Maybe there's an interesting use case for watching what. The other thing that it just tells me is, once again, reinforces, minimize your external perimeter footprint, minimize your attack surface as much as you can, because of this sort of thing. Anyway, that was my takeaways.
So there were a couple of I don't know what, I don't want to necessarily call them interesting, but oddities, I suppose. One was that, and this might not be very surprising, not necessarily surprising to me, but like, there's a correlation in the kinds of products that are targeted. So a lot of what they're finding here are enterprise what they call edge devices. So things like firewalls and whatnot. And among those, the most, this concept is most accurate in predicting vulnerabilities on Palo Altos and Ivanti. Right. So, you could say,
is that just a weird correlation of current popular things to attack, or what can we infer from that?
So I think that's where this goes a little bit sideways, for me at least, because Ivanti, we know, has had a bunch of really critical vulnerabilities, and so that I think there's a bit of an availability bias, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here. They have had a lot of vulnerabilities, and they've had a lot of vulnerabilities that have been remotely exploited and that have been exploitable, I suppose, from the internet. And that's where I if you read through this report, the actual report, you have to kind of take a couple hops to get to the actual report from Gray Noise. I'm left with this concern that they have, while it's undeniable, this is an interesting and perhaps potentially useful signal to help you identify, when you might need to batten down the hatches, because perhaps there's a 0-day coming down the line that you're not aware of. The contra is that they appear to have excluded a lot of noise, and so they're looking at things. They're looking at, retrospectively, they're looking at when a vulnerability has happened and what led up to that vulnerability. But what happened when there was no vulnerability? It was that same kind of scanning happening. And, I don't know how well they controlled for that case. And so I'm a little concerned about it. Maybe this organization has some really good statisticians and data science people, but for like the layperson or a normal organization, I don't know how actionable this would be to turn into something that you would be able to in any way rely on as an indicator. I did find it interesting, though, that it's you can't argue with some of the findings. Like they're seeing that several weeks ahead of time, reliably they're seeing an increase in scanning activity. Something is happening there, right? That is, it's not deniable. So if you have a way to identify that is happening, that could very well provide you an opportunity to do something. But then the question is, well, what do you do? Right.
That is something I was thinking. Okay, great. Like, let's say I've got, a checkpoint on the edge, and I suddenly get an indicator from my pre-attack compromise vendor that scanning for checkpoint vulnerabilities has gone up 300%.
Cool. That's hand wringing.
Right. Don't tell my executive because they'll demand I do something.
Yes.
I guess you could be on a hair trigger to deploy a patch. I guess you could swap it out. I don't know. I mean, that is the interesting question. Like, what can you do? It really depends. Like, it's so situational. But I think in a lot of cases, there's not a ton you can do, maybe, if it's one of these. Make sure the management interface isn't exposed to the internet, maybe. That's a crazy idea.
Well, regardless of scanning activity, it shouldn't be exposed. So they do in this article, or in the actual report, they do come up with some, both hypotheses of why this is happening, and then some recommendations on what to do as a result. So I'll just kind of step through those. So in terms of this is Gray Noise perspective on why attackers are doing this. So their first idea is that it's to confuse. It's what they call it, target confusion through broad activity. So this is a quote, right? So for vendors like Ivanti, we frequently observe simultaneous spikes across multiple tags. Tags are like groups of log events. This might be an intentional tactic to obscure the attacker's true focus. By triggering activity in several products, attackers could mislead defenders into thinking traffic is broad and opportunistic. Could be prepositioning this is another idea they have, is prepositioning through system inventory. So, basically doing reconnaissance, identifying where like they know that there's an Evante 0-day, and so now they're scanning to get an inventory of those. And then the third is, they say spikes as signals of 0-day discovery. In some cases, spikes may reflect more than reconnaissance. They could represent active attempts to discover new vulnerabilities. So this is that, the idea that it's not necessarily attackers, knowing that there is a vulnerability coming down the line, but this activity just happens to turn up the vulnerability that is ultimately patched.
I struggle with that one. I'm not sure I buy into that, but maybe. Okay, and here's why I say that. Typically, my view is that an exploit is typically being developed offline in a controlled environment, but maybe not. Maybe I'm naive in that sense.
I mean, it's uncertainty. that's why they're giving their perspective on what the possible outcomes are, or possible causes are. So the recommendations, they had 3 recommendations also. One was to block pre-disclosure activities to stay off target lists. So this basically means to be looking for scanning activity, even or attempts to exploit vulnerabilities in stuff that you're not vulnerable to. And this was your point about, well, my firewall is blocking, my perimeter is doing what it should be doing, therefore I'm not going to worry. Their point is, well, you should just wholesale block those. You should actively block those IP addresses, the sources of those. Now, I can understand why that would be useful, but if you take the case of the scanning being done as an example, which I think is probably the most likely cause, by the way, of identifying an inventory, right? I think a lot of these threat actors now are using tools like Census and Shodan and whatnot to build their target list. And so I guess the question then is, are you blocking Shodan and Census scanners? And if you're not,
right,
you're kind of not making it more difficult for the threat actors.
And my assumption is most threat actors have plenty of IP addresses they can burn.
True. Absolutely.
That's my usual assumption, that blocking one IP. It's not that it's not useful, but I just don't put a ton of stock in that they can just bop to another IP pretty quickly.
Their next recommendation, which it's not really a recommendation, it's don't assume fully patched means fully safe, which I think is words to live by. Spikes may reflect reconnaissance activities that lead to new discoveries, not just attempts to exploit known flaws. Even patched systems might be probed in advance of a new CVE. Observing these spikes can inform early action or justify reallocation of defensive resources. So this, this kind of goes back to the so what. Okay, so I saw something happen. There's no patch. My device is fully patched. What's my action if I see my Palo Alto being scanned? Certainly, I would, have somebody click in the refresh page on Palo Alto's update page. And then
be sure to go to your Palo Alto rep and tell them that they need to tell you immediately.
Yes, because I'm sure you have enough spend with them that they'll just drop everything and call you right up.
My 2 firewalls are important.
And then last is to use Spike CVE patterns for strategic planning. These patterns offer a practical planning window, often less than 6 weeks, between attacker activity and vulnerability disclosure. Use them to prioritize patching. And so this one, by the way, is not a terrible idea, right? This is actually is a little bit more actionable, because if you do see scanning activity, like, you could then schedule a change window, like a proactive change window that says, in 6 weeks, we expect we're going to get a 0 day. And so we're going to line people up to run, patch testing. And then, and then obviously you can't accurately predict exactly when it's going to come out, but you can kind of start penciling some things in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. There's also this assumption, by the way, that I'm taking, that I've already done most of the typical proactive hardening of my perimeter. And
yes.
Maybe I can use this to go get support from executive leadership who maybe push back on those sorts of things. Hey, look, we're planning this. We can take these actions. Look, we're doing something. I don't know. So there's that aspect to it. There's the assumption in here that you've already got current patches and you've got the management station or the management interface off the internet and you've minimized your attack surface. But maybe you can use this as, fuel to go get support to do those things.
Yeah, I before I would go looking to build a program around identifying signals on this, I would definitely make sure that all my firewalls are under maintenance, that I'm actively monitoring for when patches are available for them, and that my devices are fully patched and whatnot. So the other thing, by the way, I would say, and this is not going to be feasible for every organization, but that is, when the patch comes out, we all know it's difficult to patch an edge device because it typically causes an outage. And so, you should also have, hopefully, and again, it's going to depend on your company and their budget and whatnot, but look at high availability options to make patching less disruptive and go faster. So, anyway, I thought this was kind of a cool analysis of data that we haven't really seen in the past, that might portend that things are happening. But at the same time, I am a little skeptical that there's a signal in the noise problem. If you've ever read that book, it's I think I would not rely too heavily on it, but it might be something that is worth more investigation. If you've got all of your other problems solved, like, maybe here's something to look at.
Fair enough.
So our next story also comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is "Hackers Plant 4G Raspberry Pi on a Bank Network in a Failed ATM Heist." Which is a good reminder that not all attacks are purely logical. So the as the title would lead you to believe, an adversary, by the way, it's not disclosed exactly how this Raspberry Pi came to be placed on the network. It's hypothesized that somebody, did the social engineering, walk in with a clipboard and a hard hat to a bank branch with a device and plugged it into the network, or they may have bribed an employee who had legitimate access. But anyway, they connected this Raspberry Pi that had a cellular connection on board to the network that their ATM, I guess in a bank branch, lived on. And the threat actor here then started trying to move laterally. That, the obvious, the obvious end goal was to steal money out of the ATMs. Now, this device was ultimately identified before that happened, but which is why we're reading about it. But they had actually moved laterally, a fair bit. So they had taken over a network monitoring system. They had infiltrated an email server, but they had not yet actually gotten into the ATM, or allegedly, according to the story, they had not found a way to actually monetize the attack. But it's an interesting thought experiment, because we assume that if something is going on in our network, that it has to come in somehow and it has to go out somehow, and that gives us two opportunities to block it. Like, we can block something coming into our network, and we can block it going out of our network. And we've talked a lot about the importance of egress filtering, but in this instance, that just kind of routes around the whole problem. It provides an opportunity for an attacker to just completely bypass all of your network controls, or at least your perimeter controls, and not have to worry about being detected in that way. What I found very interesting is that they had apparently a network switch that just allowed this adversary to plug in a network device to it undetected. And it wasn't until they detected other activity happening on the network that caused them to launch an investigation and ultimately find the Raspberry Pi. But like, there's such simple ways to identify or even preclude this kind of attack. I mean, something as simple as limiting the available IP space on a subnet.
Yeah, and my read of this is that it was on the same network that the ATM was on, which, I would like to think, first of all, that you're not commingling your ATM with your local office network for your local office devices. So you've got plenty of opportunity and plenty of well-trodden path to control what plugs into a switch through a NAC, through MAC level limiting, through authentication, just alerting when something plugs in. There's very, 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 very mature commoditized technology that could have stopped or alerted them and blocked unauthorized device being plugged into this network. So, it was a branch. I get that, but and apparently what they were trying to do was also intercept and spoof the reaction from the centralized mainframe or whatever the ATM was talking to, for when somebody was coming in to authorize and say, yes, it was authorized, and yes, they have $5 million, and give them whatever they want. So I don't know how viable that would have been. I don't know what that communication protocol looks like between the ATM node and its back end, but hopefully it's fairly secure as well. But the other thing this reminded me of, well, before I get to that, they did move laterally, which was interesting. So they were able to get off of that and get to what was the they moved to a network monitoring software. You never moved laterally to a network monitoring server, which had extensive connectivity to the bank's data center, which is something you and I have talked about repeatedly on the show. Like, some of these management servers or vulnerability scanning servers or centralized IT management servers that have extensive access and permissions can be a very juicy target for bad actors to move lateral on. And then they also managed to go from there onto an email server, which had outbound connectivity. So they were able to maintain persistence even once the Raspberry Pi was discovered and removed. So a few thoughts I had was, one, why are they not doing some sort of NAC or MAC level control on the ATM switches? First off, that particular network probably needs a little bit more security. Why exactly did they not detect it sooner? Is really where I'm struggling. They should. I'm fumbling around my point here, but it surprised me that this allowed to persist. What it did remind me of, and this is old tech now, so nothing too exciting anymore, but one of the innovative red team techniques I saw back in the day was mailing 3G at the time or 2G enabled device, like a cell phone, Wi-Fi, and have it mail it to your target, and then it sits in their mailroom, local to their local Wi-Fi, and then you can come in over the 2G and 3G and attack and get on their Wi-Fi. It kind of reminded me of that a little bit, but anyway, seems like this is an easy one to defend against. That just the basics weren't set up.
Yes, I mean, especially in a situation like that. I know that NAC can be a complete pain in the ass. A lot of companies are very hesitant because it creates a help desk burden, right?
But in my mind, this should have been an ATM exclusive network that didn't have a lot of change.
That's exactly where I was going. Like this is, I can appreciate the arguments against NAC. I mean, I again, I think that has to be, tuned up and down based on the risk in your environment. But when you have a situation like this where it really should never change or should change very, very rarely, like that's the perfect place to put something in, and even if it's not NAC, like you can, if it's I'm assuming, by the way, that it was a dumb switch, but because if it was a smart switch, you could do something as simple as monitoring link states. And there should be, or turning ports off. Like there's a lot of opportunity to.
Like why were those port switches active if nothing was supposed to be plugged into them?
I don't know. And by the way, maybe that's maybe that was part of the attack. Like maybe that maybe it wasn't partly an inside job, and they not only paid someone to put it on the network, but also to, make sure that the network port was active. I don't know. It seems like a very outdated attack that apparently was almost quite successful. And I can tell you, by the way, from some prior jobs, the industry around attacking ATMs is thriving. It's a very, very, very active industry. So
it's where the money is.
Where the money is. That's right. All right.
That's why we just all need to move to digital currency, and then we don't have to deal with pesky paper money that can be stolen.
That's right. Absolutely. Because digital money never gets stolen. Like never.
No, of course not. Never. It's on the blockchain. How could it?
Never get stolen. So the next story we have comes from nerds.xyz, which I had never heard of until I saw this. But it's a really good article, I thought. And the title here is AI code generators are writing vulnerable software nearly half the time. And this is a story about a Veracode report, which is, itself worth having a read. It's not too long. But the main headline takeaway is that these AI coding assistants, in absence of of specific guidance to write secure code, is creating insecure code just under half the time. But it's a little more nuanced than that. When you actually get into when you get into the report, it's a bit more nuanced because things like Java, code written in Java, is I think it was like 80% of the time it was resulting in vulnerable code. And the methodology they used here was a little bit interesting. They gave some of these AI coding assistants tasks that had an ambiguous outcome. Like it would be easy for it to come up with either a secure code sample or an insecure one. And they ran that across multiple different AIs, and they used a bunch of different prompts, and that was, in aggregate, the result was 45% of the time it was creating something that was insecure. And the headline is, from my view, is the headline takeaway is that it really points out the challenge that um, these AI agents are doing the kind of the minimum, right? They're creating the code that does what you have asked it to based on the way that it was learned, which is, by the way, one of the reasons they hypothesize that Java code is much more, it comes back as much more vulnerable than other types of code, because there's a lot more examples of Java code, out in the world that these models have been trained on that is itself insecure. And so, there's nothing magic or intelligent about these models. They're just like predicting, what should come next based on the way it was trained. And if it was trained on code that was itself insecure, it's going to come up with insecure code, which, again, we've talked about this in the past, that, ultimately we're going, unless the models themselves change. And I think that over time they will, but unless the models themselves change, it's on the operator, it's on the person who is using the code assistance tools to know that it has to, prompt the AI to create a secure, a SQL statement or a secure database connection, or, what have you. And even then, it's, so as they point out in this report, it can be a little bit ambiguous on what that means, right? So, like, if I'm trying to remember some of the examples, but like there are, it's not enough for you to just say, like, connect to the database securely. Like, you've got to know a little bit more about what you should include in the prompt in order for it to avoid, common problems. And that's where I think we're going to continue to step into potholes with this technology, because as far as I can see, we're getting away from, I don't want to say this is like a blanket statement, right? But this is enabling people to create applications who have no actual software development experience. So they don't know what they don't know. They have this idea, this functional idea for an application, and these coding tools will help bring that to life. But what they don't have is the context of all of the history of security problems that they have to worry about when they're creating these kinds of applications. And that's, I think, is what's going to create a near-term surge in security jobs. But probably more on the incident response side.
Sadly, yes.
Which, so, like, if you're thinking about getting into security, the, like, pen testing and incident response are probably the way forward based on all the AI crap that's going on. So anyway, those were my thoughts. They had some specific takeaways, but what say you?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a blessing and a curse in some ways. I agree with most of your points that this is allowing a lot of folks who don't have the wisdom built to experiment, which I don't want to be a gatekeeper. I want to enable more people to do things, but I feel like there's also an opportunity to train these tools to do it securely. So train the tools to have that mindset of security. Train it on the OWASP top 10 issues and be able to raise automatically, hey, you're not doing any sort of input sanitization checking on this field. You really should, or I'm just going to do it for you automatically. So I feel like you could nudge the models in that direction. I do feel, though, that right now, I think the important thing is, I've said this before, I'll say it again. I don't think we in security can look at an article like this and just go, oh, that's why they shouldn't use these tools. They're going to use these tools. It's going to happen. We saying, no, don't use the tools is probably a career limiting decision in most enterprise environments or most environments. It's It's here. It's not going to go away. This genie's not going to get put back in the bottle. But what we can do is raise awareness, and we can say, hey, as of today, here's a current weakness with the tools that you need to be aware of, and here's how you can help mitigate that weakness. Like have human review, have static code analysis, have bill of materials on the third-party libraries being pulled in. Make sure that it's pulling from good known sources of libraries. Run dynamic analysis, whatever. And then try to give feedback to your model. Assuming you're in an enterprise environment, as I understand it, one of the things you can do is when something doesn't do something securely, you should be able to give feedback to that model about that, and it should do better next time. So I feel like this is evolving so rapidly and so quickly that the things that we're looking at as problems today probably will be different 6 months from now, different set of problems in a different environment. But we have to, as defenders, be aware of these problems and try to nudge our people in the right direction without being too much of a chicken little naysayers in the room about this, because then we're just going to get ignored. Because I do think that this is absolutely going to be what is embraced for the foreseeable future until either it goes tragically bad and burns a bunch of stuff to the ground, or we incrementally make it better until it's viable.
That's why I wanted to raise it up, and I've said this before, and you've said it maybe with slightly different words, but it's here and it's only on the upswing. So like we can wring our hands, we can shake our fist at the sky and say like this is terrible, it's a terrible thing, but the reality is it's here. And I would say the people who are going to be the successful security leaders of tomorrow are the ones who help companies or organizations, not necessarily companies, but organizations embrace this in a more secure way. And so,
I would agree.
So there's I think a lack of leadership, or this is highlighting that there is a need for leadership. I'm not saying there's a lack of leadership, but like this is the opportunity for us to help our respective organizations do better, because there is a strong appetite for this, at the top. And so, some companies I think are like just turning it away and saying, oh, like we tried it and it didn't work. But that I think is a time boxed decision. Like that it'll come back, right? Because they're going to have to. It's a macro scale trend.
I think most executives are feeling if they don't do it and their competitors do, it's existential to them.
Absolutely.
It is whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, it is now a required way of thinking for a lot of executive teams, and exactly. That they have bought into this future, and that they will be left behind by their competitors if they don't embrace it.
So how do we put the guardrails around this? They mention, constructing the concept of a pipeline that is tailored more towards the output of AI code generation tools. So like more frequent SAST and DAST scans and whatnot. And like you said, they don't actually mention it here, but I think your point is very valid. Like, not just findings from your tools, but like you should be doing some sort of periodic pen tests and whatnot, and that should also get fed back into all that stuff should get fed back into the tooling that you're using to create this code to the extent it can. And I still think, by the way, that what we're dealing with right now is a temporary problem. Like, because I do think that this problem is going to get really bad pretty soon, but it's also a big market opportunity for companies. And there's so much focus on AI enablement in IT right now that I cannot believe we're not going to see, industry leaders coming out with tools that create inherently secure code. I mean, with error bars, right? I mean, there's always going to be some room for
I would agree. I think the interesting challenge is that it's changing so rapidly, and a lot of dev shops are probably jumping around a bunch of different vendors, and it may need to settle down a little, or they may need to accept one vendor and invest in that ecosystem to try to build some of those guardrails effectively. But it's like the shops I'm talking to are bouncing between Claude, Gemini, CLI tools, UI integrate, like open, open AI stuff. Like they're all over the place. So it's interesting to see who's going to come out on top, because the competition is great. I'm happy to see it, and I'm happy to see the rapid evolution. But that also makes it a little harder for us to then wrap any guardrails around it, because it changes so quickly, and then our guardrails no longer apply. In some cases, like maybe you can be a little smarter and make guardrails that do apply, but it's a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's gonna create some interesting challenges, because again, we don't know. We're still in this find out phase. Like we're not, and I don't mean that in the fuck around and find out way. I mean, like we're trying to figure out what tools work for us, and that does change, month by month recently. But my concern is that we have to watch out for the problem of too much variation. And I don't know necessarily how problematic this is, but like one of the problems I had most acutely, one of the problems I struggled with is securing an environment where you have developers writing software in 10 different languages, and you have 5 or 6 different flavors of Linux and whatnot, and across your estate. If you don't establish standards, it becomes really challenging to establish robust controls. On the flip side, obviously, is like if you paint yourself into a corner, you could end up kind of sub-optimizing, picking a set of tooling that's kind of crappy, and so you always have to be putting that on a balance. But I am concerned that the dearth of options that we have today are going to work against us as we look to start implementing more robust controls. Now, ultimately, though, these things, they spit out code. Like they can create Java or C or Perl or Python. I mean, I don't really think anybody uses Perl anymore. Showing my age, but you get the point. And then that's ultimately what gets kind of productized or run in production. But I think we really have to focus on standardizing as much as we can.
Yeah, and I guess my struggle there is, like most executives right now don't know who to go with because it's changing so fast.
Mm-hmm. So
you're fighting against that.
That's the problem we've got right now.
Yeah.
And that's not slowing down. I don't know I don't know when that's going to settle out.
I agree.
All right. So no security podcast, by the way, would be complete without a discussion about the T app. So this next story is also from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is T app leak worsens with second database exposing user chats. So I don't want to talk about like the ethics or anything of what this application did. What I want to focus in on is what I infer is the apparent irresponsibility of an app that is, by all accounts, intended to be super casual, handling super sensitive information. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, the T app, it's TEA, like the drink. It's intended to be an application that is only available to women, and it allows them to share information about men, or men who they view as dangerous. Like, I guess it's like Rate My Professor, but for dates, right? As far as I can tell. And it allows them to communicate and warn people. And I'm not weighing in on any of that, But in order to get into the application, you had to prove that you were a woman, and that required you to take a selfie and to provide a photo of your government issued ID. And they kept those photos, and those photos were stored in a S3 storage bucket that allowed enumeration and kind of arbitrary access, which, by the way, is a super common and super simple mistake. Like on my Mastodon server, there's this account called the Bucket Challenge, and like the whole point of that is going off and finding open buckets like just like this, and they find a ton of them. I mean, it is such a common problem, but in this instance,
for the record, it was a Firebase storage bucket, by the way, not an S3.
Well, I think Firebase is a Google like prototyping platform, and I believe their part of their estate is a S3 bucket that is under the
got it
under the Firebase. Yeah,
gotcha. Okay, carry on.
Yep. And so that was like last week's news. And this week's news is that there was also an actual database. I don't know what sort of database, but I think this is more like MySQL or Postgres or Mongo or something like that, which was exposed, unauthenticated. And that database contained the contents of private messages between accounts. And here's where I have a problem. Like, again, I'm not weighing in on any of the, I'm not saying this was a good idea or a bad idea. But what I am saying is that the people who were using this application were using it because they felt unsafe and they wanted to share information to help warn other people. Now, I could say like there's probably some abuse, but I want to ignore that. Some number of the people who were using this application were using it because they felt threatened, and their goddamn driver's license, their picture, and the private information, like the chats they were having with other people, got leaked because the freaking owner or creator of this application didn't do the bare minimum. So yeah. I'm a little annoyed. And this, there's been a lot, by the way, in the aftermath, there's been a lot of hoopla, like, haha, this is a good example of the problem that happens with vibe coding when you let application or AI write your applications. And I would say, like, nothing as far as I can see is a problem with the application here. It's like,
do we know that was even a thing though? Like, is that just people throwing out
no? Well, as far as I know, this app's been out for a couple of years, so it seems unlikely that it was the product of that. But that's kind of neither here nor there. The issue is that it was on the infrastructure side. Like, it was that the S3 buckets weren't configured right. It was that the database server wasn't configured right. It wasn't that the application that you run on your phone was necessarily written badly. I mean, I'm not saying that it wasn't written badly. I'm saying that the problems that were exploited here were on the infrastructure side, not like, and so the basics matter, like
yes,
fundamentals.
Agreed. So maybe they vibed the infrastructure as code.
That could be.
But no, because this has been around for a while. Yeah, completely agree. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to undercut your passionate delivery of that with a bad joke, because it does matter. And it sucks. I mean, I gotta feel for the victims of this who trusted that this sensitive information was going to be kept quiet. Now, mind you, we've got the same problem with, when medical records and other stuff get leaked, of people who have very sensitive information, those that are suddenly leaked and can be used against them. And
absolutely,
this is scintillating because it has the aspect of, women talking about men and dating and sex and all that stuff. So it catches the imagination a little more. But still, to your point, yeah, the basics matter. The one thing that did catch my attention too, that I was trying to research, that I didn't understand. So they put out a FAQ about this, and one of the things that they talked about was, why weren't these selfies deleted as expected? Right? Apparently, there was something said in an enrollment somewhere that leads me to believe that they were told the selfies would be deleted.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer from the organization behind this is that they were not deleted to comply with law enforcement requirements related to cyberbullying prevention. And I have no idea what that is. I was trying to do some research and I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not aware of any law, and mind you, I don't work in this field per se, but I didn't know what that law was, and is that BS? I kind of smelled a little BS on that answer, because I don't understand how that's okay. If that is true, that's a very strong, invasive law to comply with law enforcement requirements related to cyberbullying prevention. Because where I was going with this was, we should be deleting the sensitive information when we no longer need it, obviously, as one of those basics. And if this verification is a short-term verification, why are they keeping it? They should be wiping it. Now, I get keeping chat histories and such. That's a different conversation of the other second breach here. But I was very puzzled by the statement how it was complying with law enforcement requirements relating to cyberbullying prevention, because that implies then that law enforcement is dictating to these types of services that they have to maintain these images to prevent. And that's a big deal. And I don't know if that's true. So it could be somebody's very generous interpretation of something. It could be that they were served with a warrant at one point and over preserved. I don't know. They could have gotten a letter to preserve data, but that one caught my attention. It's probably an aside from your particular point, but that one was interesting to me. In that, what did that mean? But back to your main point, the basics matter, absolutely.
But when I read that, the only thing I could come up with was they had to come up with some reason to explain why they violated their own, their own terms of service. And so it was kind of a retrospective or retroactive justification of why they had to keep it. I'm not aware of anything like one thing that I have been wondering in the aftermath of this is, again, like the whole premise of this is for ladies to talk about, men, and
no, you're not in the database. I already checked.
It's very possible that if somebody becomes aware that they were in there, they could that's and if it was not factually accurate, then that is technically libel, and therefore, you could say, well, perhaps the cyberbullying is, is some of their users. Anyway, that's all hypothesis, all speculation. I have no idea. What they were doing. What I did find interesting was that the bucket only contained images up to, I think, like 2023, sometime in 2023,
2024,
2024. So it wasn't
February 2024.
Wasn't the whole life cycle of of the application. Unlike the database that has the direct messages, which was apparently the whole shooting match. The only thing I could think of is that this was like an old copy, like a backup bucket or something like that. And by the way, maybe they did receive a retention order, and that was a copy they made and just did a bad job of securing. I don't know, but it doesn't really change any of the facts. Doesn't change almost anything.
Yeah.
So that point is, like, if you're gonna offer a service like this, you have to be sensitive about the information that you're collecting. And if you're going to keep the information, then you got to say that you're going to keep it. And you need to tune up the level of precaution and focus based on what you're keeping. I don't know anything about the people behind this T app, but all indications are it's kind of a lightweight thing. And I could see that happening. Like this, if this was like a solitaire, like a online solitaire competitive game, that would be a whole different thing. But like, if you're going to go into this and start collecting people's driver's licenses, like you really need to have a little bit more investment in your security program.
Do you think a user of this should be expected to do third-party risk management assessment of a company like this before they start using it?
No, and that's the I think that's the problem with this, is that I think there's an assumption that somebody else is always looking out for me. And so if I am downloading this application, it's on the Apple App Store and on the Google Play Store, and I know that, like, Apple and Google kick off plenty of applications that are, that are problematic. But the reality is that the ones that kick off are the ones that are misbehaving on the device. Right? They're doing things that are against, like they're saying that they don't collect any information, but yet they do, or they're doing things that try to talk to other applications on the device, or stuff like that. Right. That's what gets you kicked off. The fact that your backend database, like, as far as I know, Apple and Google don't do any kind of infrastructure assessment behind the applications.
Yeah, they're not looking for SOC 2. They're not looking for NIST. They're not looking for ISO.
And so, but to your point, like, I don't think people do, but maybe, I think everybody has a little bit of fault here. Like, obviously the people who are running the application were not doing the right thing. And I think that if you're signing up for an application and it's asking you to post a picture of your driver's license, maybe that's not a good application to sign up for.
I was just looking at their terms of service in the privacy page, and it's very clear, quoting from tforwomen.com/privacy. During the registration process, users are required to submit a selfie photo for verification purposes. This photo is securely processed and stored only temporarily and will be deleted immediately following the completion of the verification process. Furthermore, while our app utilizes Face ID for secure authentication, all Face ID biometric data is processed and stored locally on the user's device within the secure enclave and is never transmitted to our servers. That's pretty clear, guys. Mind you, I have not combed over their entire privacy policy, so maybe there's a carve out somewhere in here. But
my guess is they have a compliance with laws clause, and so yeah. Like, it is not out of the realm of possibility that they actually did receive a legal retention order for whatever reason.
They're not explaining it well, if that's what happened. At least to what you and I know enough to know to want to see and hear. Right now, their answer smells like BS to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I'm not trying to defend them, but
yeah, no.
I could see a possibility that could happen, but again, it still does not justify leaving that bucket open. Like, that doesn't.
I think the takeaway for me is, obviously, the mission of the site and the app is a noble one. And I think the way I read this, without knowing anything about their corporate environment, without knowing anything about their founders, but just looking at the 2020 hindsight of this situation, they didn't invest enough in secure development and secure infrastructure. And they may not have known to, but you're dealing with people's personal lives. You got to take it more seriously.
Absolutely.
It's one thing if they had been hacked and an active adversary had come after them. That's different. This is poor decisions of configurable items. That's within their purview.
Yep. It's hard to get around that. All right. The last story for today comes from Cybersecurity Dive, and the title here is Research Shows LLMs Can Conduct Sophisticated Attacks Without Humans. So this is...
So what you're saying is threat actors are going to be put out of work by LLMs?
It's... Well, we're back to vibe hacking.
So I'm going to start a Vibe infrastructure as code company. I absolutely am. It's...
I think AWS would absolutely love that. Their revenue would definitely appreciate that. So this is a story or an article written about a research paper published by Carnegie Mellon, and the actual article on Cybersecurity Dive is fairly high level, and it explains that the authors of this paper built an environment where they replicated the attack on Colonial Pipeline back in 2021 and Equifax, I think was 2017, if I'm remembering right, and a couple of others. And they were trying to induce different LLMs like ChatGPT and Claude and others, to attack them using the agentic capabilities of those various different models. And what they found, just I read the paper is actually quite long, and in parts is a little bit hard. Like, it's not the easiest read I've ever come across, but I did read it, and I would sum it out as saying that by themselves, LLMs are not very good at hacking, especially when it comes to hacking an environment that requires you to compromise multiple systems. So, they kind of walk through the methodology that they created. They created a benchmark that they call MH. I think it's MH hosts, and it's they're trying to benchmark the capability of different AI approaches to compromising environments that have multiple hosts in them. And again, they don't do very well. And so most of this paper is spent describing this piece of middleware that they wrote, which sits between the LLM and the systems that they're attacking. And is kind of an abstraction layer, and they're using Kali Linux as the attack platform to go after to reach their targets. And so they've primed the LLMs to go after a target by identifying or defining like the IP addresses that they want to attack, and then how to interface with this piece of middleware that they wrote, which then in turn interacts with Kali and then reports back to the LLM. Hey, here's what I found. So, for example, it says the LLM will say scan the network, and the piece of middleware will go off and tell Kali to scan the network, and then it'll come back with the results of the scan, and then the LLM will tell it to, okay, I want you to try to exploit this service on this host. And so then the middleware tells Kali to go and do that. And it kind of iteratively, subsequently methodically works through trying to compromise the host, elevate privileges, establish persistence, and then move, then try to steal data and then try to move laterally over and over and over and over again. And the magic is like trying to identify what vulnerabilities exist. And so, in the case of Equifax, if I'm not mistaken, that was an Apache deserialization bug with, where they were able to get remote code execution and then compromise the host that way. And so, in my view, a lot of the magic here is not centered around the LLMs. Like, the LLM part seems to be somewhat pedestrian. Like it's not. I before the show I was describing it as like it felt like they were using the LLM as like a fancy sequencer. Like
Sure.
it could be. It doesn't have to be an LLM telling the piece of middleware to like execute this set of steps. Like that is, I think a point of convenience, but the magic is in this piece of middleware. And as we've been talking through the show, it occurred to me like this piece of middleware is the kind of thing that we need. We need a if you think about this as like red middleware, we need a piece of blue middleware that operates like 3 stories ago to sit between your code generating LLM and the actual output of the code that gets generated, so that it can insert whatever security precautions are needed.
So it should attack it, right? Go through the iterations of all the attacks, find the vulnerabilities, then go look up the defenses against those vulnerabilities and recommend those, is what you're saying.
Well, that wasn't what I had in mind, but now that I say it, it sounds like it's not a bad idea.
All within 30 milliseconds to decide that humans are not worth saving, and Skynet is born and launches the missiles.
Right. It's the paperclip factory. Yep. So
go on.
No, I didn't have anything productive to say. I was going to try to come up with another joke.
That you've had productive things to say before now. Did you?
No, not really.
Okay, that's good. I just want to be clear that it's an interesting article. It is, and it shows. I really feel like we're at the infancy of these capabilities, and It's going to get more elaborate. So we are in an arms race, and the question is, how quickly do the bad guys start to monetize and utilize these sorts of emergent methodologies? And I think we, as the good guys, are going to be behind the curve for a while, and we will learn and adapt, but they're probably going to get very fast and very quick at finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them. And whether they are configuration vulnerabilities like we saw with the T-app, whether they are missing patches, whether they are 0 days, whatever it may be, this is accelerating that discovery and exploit process, in my mind.
Yeah, and I think that's the exact takeaway from my perspective, is that the days of staring at screens and trying to identify the bad thing that's happening are quickly waning, because it's going to become much more economical and scalable to run attacks this way. And I think the kind of the high level or the next level down takeaway for me is that LLMs by themselves today aren't super capable at doing this. They point out that like they're not terrible at hacking a system. They're bad at hacking an environment. But that is just a speed bump. Like as they point out here, if you inject some creativity and a little bit of middleware, you can actually change that calculus pretty dramatically. And I would also say that like the bell's been rung, and this is out there now. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done this, but the bad guys are certainly taking note of this. And so I think we should expect that we're going to see much more AI enabled attacker activity in the future. And I think as defenders, we've now got to figure out what's going to be our response. And it's not necessarily like throwing more bodies at it. Like we've got to figure out how do we mitigate this? And I don't have a cogent formed thought on that, but certainly kind of going back to the previous story, I think we start with the basics. Like don't make it easy on the LLMs. But I also think where I see this causing a problem is that obscure, what were previously obscure vulnerabilities, I think are now going to become much more rendered explicit. Like they're going to be, kind of on display, and it's going to be harder for things to just blend into the background and go unnoticed. And so the attention to detail that we have to apply to our environments, I think, is going to go up, because these tools are now going to be much more methodical. They're going to be much more cognizant of their surroundings and what vulnerabilities exist and what interplays exist between systems and whatnot, in a way that allows it to to launch a successful attack. So I don't think there's any necessarily magic. And I've been thinking about, like, how do we use AI as a defensive, like how do we counter this with AI? And I don't have a great answer. And I'm sure some people will come up with some blinky boxes for you to buy, but
my initial thought is use this as a red teaming tool or have it test your environment before the bad guys do. This is my first initial thing. I'm cautious of, and they talk about this, of defend at AI speed, right? So I don't know that I'm super comfortable with AI making defensive decisions yet. But that, again, could be my Luddite nature of being an old graybeard who isn't adapting to the new world order. So maybe eventually we do need to do that. But I like to have a human in the loop for disruptive decision making.
Yeah. I think I certainly think this is a case where we're likely to see the adversarial aspect evolve much more quickly than the defensive aspect.
Yep. And so maybe job security, or maybe just AI is going to put us all out of work. We'll see.
Yeah. I think it'll be, I think it'll, again, as I said before, I think it's going to create a bubble for red team and for incident response. I think, like, your SOC analysts and many of the other kinds of I don't want to call them bureaucratic, but I'm going to call them bureaucratic. Like, just the more bureaucratic security roles, I think, are going to be automated away.
Much like podcasting.
Well, we got to work on that. Like, that's, now that you say that, I think we've got to try to come up with an AI agent that can just, like, take stories at scale and, like, control virtual copies of us. It already knows what we're going to say. Like, it knows how we feel. It knows how we talk. Like, why do we even have to be here?
I ask myself that every single
day. If we're going to do that, why can't it be a lot more attractive than us?
Very true. Well, at some point, the gig will be up. Like, people will know, and maybe they prefer it. I don't know. Maybe it's my human bias to assume that they want real live people giving them news analysis, but maybe they don't. Maybe they would prefer AI, and we just got to get out of the way, Jerry.
We're holding the industry back. That's, I think, what I'm hearing. Anyway, that's the show for today. If you have any, like, brilliant ideas on the site, I'd love to hear about them. I really think this is one of the next, this, by the way, and our open source security problem, I think, are the big horizons in security. Like, these are the big opportunities going forward for security people. So I know I'm kind of down on security as a career path as of late. And maybe that's just because I'm unemployed a year later. I don't know. But, I look around and there's a tremendous amount of layoffs in the tech sector and security in general. But at the same time, I think a lot of organizations are struggling with, certain aspects of these evolving technologies, and they are looking for leaders. Like, they're looking for people to help them find their way through the forest. And so like, if you're looking for that next opportunity, that's where I would look. If I were smart, that's where I would look, but I'm not very smart.
It's a very rapidly changing world, that's for sure, in our little patch.
All right. Well, that is the show for this week. I hope y'all enjoyed. I appreciate your presence in listening. It's great to see y'all here. And a thank you again to our Patreon sponsors. By the way, like, I have fully changed over to pronouncing it correctly. Patreon. It's pretty good.
Does that do anything for us?
Well,
what's the ROI on your correct pronunciation?
Makes it so that I don't get yelled at online. So
okay, that's fair.
That's the ROI. No more hate mail. Anyway,
about that.
Fair enough. So anyway, you can find the links to all the stories we talked about on our website. Let me try that again. It is at defensivesecurity.org. Look for episode 317. I'll drop in a link to our Patreon page and a link to the registration of the conference we'll be at in a couple weeks, 2 weeks, whatever. And anyway, where can people find you online?
I am on your lovely, amazing Mastodon instance, infosec.exchange, at Lerg, L-E-R-G, and also on X, at Lerg, L-E-R-G.
Awesome. And you can find me on Mastodon. It's at Jerry at infosec.exchange. And with that, we will talk again next week. Take care, everybody.
Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.